Burnt coffee smells the same everywhere. Army mess halls, forward operating bases, hospital break rooms. It's always the same scorched, bitter undertone that clings to the back of your throat and pretends to be comfort. Maren Tillotson had been drinking bad coffee for 15 years. She was good at it by now. She stood at the nurses' station of Ridgecrest Community Hospital's overnight ICU, both hands wrapped around a paper cup that had stopped being hot somewhere around 2 in the morning. The ward was quiet in the way that only hospitals at 3 a.m. could be quiet. Not peaceful, exactly, but suspended. Held breath, the kind of silence that always felt like it was waiting for permission to become noise. She preferred this shift. Days were busy and loud and full of people asking questions she didn't want to answer. Nights, the hospital emptied out. The hallways thinned. Nobody looked at you too closely under the washed-out glow of the overhead panels, and the ones who did look were usually too tired to care about what they saw. What they saw, when they bothered to look, was not particularly interesting. Maren Tillotson, 36, night shift ICU nurse, approximately 5'6", with dark hair scraped back into a practical knot at the base of her skull, and the kind of flat expression that discouraged small talk. She wore her scrubs a size too big on purpose, and she walked with a slight forward lean that one of the younger nurses had once described as intense, and that Maren had spent 30 seconds deciding whether to find funny. She hadn't gone to the last 3 birthday celebrations, organized in the break room. She had signed the cards. It was enough. "Bed 702 is drifting," said a voice to her left. That was Phoebe. Phoebe Dunn. 24 years old, 4 months out of nursing school, still in the phase where she looked slightly surprised every time a patient's condition changed, as though illness had not yet revealed itself to be fundamentally unpredictable. She was a good nurse in the way that new nurses sometimes were, cautious, thorough, diligent with documentation, but she had not yet learned to trust her instincts over her protocols. Maren glanced at the monitor display on the wall panel. "He's on 3 liters. Sat's still 94. Should I call Dr. Hagen? Not yet." Maren set down her paper cup. "Titrate him up to 4. If he drops below 92, then call Hagen." Phoebe hesitated. "The order doesn't say I can. I'll co-sign the adjustment. Go." Phoebe went, sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. Maren picked up her coffee again. The liquid was cold now and faintly metallic, the way it always got when it sat too long in those particular cups. She drank it anyway. She had learned to sleep in 4-hour increments and eat standing up and drink whatever was available regardless of temperature or taste. The Army had taught her that the Army, and then the particular stretch of years that came after the Army, that she didn't have a neat name for. The interval between who she had been and who she had decided to become instead. That interval had lasted, on and off, about 4 years. It had taken place in locations she was not at liberty to name in paperwork, and it had involved skills that were not listed on her nursing license. On paper, she had served 6 years as a combat medic, honorable discharge, 2 deployments, a fistful of commendations that lived at the bottom of a moving box she had never fully unpacked. That was accurate as far as it went. The rest of it didn't go anywhere on paper. The ICU at 3 a.m. was as familiar to her as anything had ever been. She knew which panels hummed at which pitch. She knew the particular hollow rhythm of the ventilator, on bed. 3, the faint mechanical sighing, in and out, that you stopped hearing consciously after about 20 minutes, and started hearing only when it changed. She knew the way the light shifted at the end of the corridor at 4 a.m. When the cleaning staff came through, the low rumble of the floor polisher, a half-second warning before the smell of industrial lemon reached the station. She knew this place the way soldiers knew their posts. Every sightline, every sound that was normal and therefore ignorable, every sound that was not. The elevator at the end of the hallway chimed at 3:47 a.m. Maren's fingers paused over the keyboard. Visitors were not permitted in the ICU after 9. There were exceptions. Palliative situations. Families given special clearance by the attending. Those visits were pre-arranged. They were expected. The on-duty nurse was notified. Maren had not been notified. She kept her eyes on the screen. She listened. Footsteps. More than one person. The rhythm was wrong for hospital staff. Too deliberate, too evenly spaced. No shuffle or hurry. Not the drag-heeled exhaustion of residents or the efficient clip of attending physicians. Not the soft tread of chaplains or the squeak of housekeeping. Something in the base of her skull tightened. An old reflex. The kind that didn't have a name in any medical text because it had not been acquired in any medical school. She turned her head by degrees, keeping her posture loose, and looked toward the hallway. 3 people. 2 men and a woman. They were dressed in civilian clothes, dark jackets, heavy boots, the kind of unbranded tactical gear that tried to look like regular outdoor wear and didn't quite manage it. The woman was compact, close-cropped hair, a jaw like a blade. One of the men was very tall, with a beard going gray at the edges. The other was younger, with a rigid quality to the way he held his right arm, not a natural stillness, a controlled one. The kind you developed after a certain type of injury to the shoulder. They swept the ward the way people swept rooms when they had been trained to do so, left to right, corners first, the exits. Then the tall man's gaze found the nurse's station. It found Maren. Something cold moved through her chest. She placed both palms flat on the counter, very carefully, and did not move. They crossed the ward without stopping. The woman with the close-cropped hair glanced at Phoebe, who had returned from bed 7, and was now standing near the medication cart, watching with her mouth slightly open. The woman's expression communicated something that made Phoebe take a single step backward and stay there. The 3 of them stopped on the other side of the nurse's station counter. For a moment, nobody spoke. "Tillotson," the tall man said. He did not say it like a question. He said it the way people said a word they had been holding in their mouths for a very long time, carefully, like something that might break. Maren looked at him, at his face, at the gray threading his beard and the set of his shoulders and the particular way he was standing, which was the way people stood when they were holding themselves very still, because they were afraid that if they moved, they might do something embarrassing. She had not seen Garrett Lowe in 4 years. She had not expected to see him again. She had, at various points, assumed he was dead, the last confirmed report she had access to, and her access, at that point, had been considerably more than a civilian nurse's, had placed his unit in a situation with poor odds of resolution. He was not dead. He was standing in front of her in her hospital at 3:47 in the morning, with the woman and the man she now recognized as Petra Sondergaard, and a younger soldier whose name she was pulling slowly from somewhere deep and locked, Dawit. His last name wouldn't come. She remembered his hands, steady hands, even when everything else was noise. "You're hard to find," Lowe said. "I wasn't hiding," Maren said. Her voice came out flat and even. She was mildly surprised. "My name is in the state nursing registry." "We weren't looking in nursing registries," Sondergaard said. Her voice was like the rest of her, clipped, functional, no excess. How long? Maren asked. 3 months, Lowe said. Give or take. 3 months. She processed that without showing it. She had been at Ridgecrest for 11 months. That meant they had found her 8 months in. That meant they had sat on it for 3 months before coming. She didn't know yet what that meant about why they were here. You're not supposed to be on this floor, she said. ICU is restricted access after 9. We know, Sondergaard said, with an expression that made clear how relevant she considered that information. Maren looked at Dawit. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not hostile, not warm, careful. The way you looked at something you weren't sure yet was safe to approach. His right arm. She had been right about the shoulder. There was hardware under that sleeve. She could see the faint ridge of a compression wrap above the wrist. What happened to your arm? She asked. Something shifted in his face. Kandahar, 14 months ago. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that. She filed it. Tillotson. Lowe's voice was different now, quieter. The register that she associated with people who were about to say something that cost them something. We're not here to bring anything back. I want you to know that. We're not here too. We didn't come to drag anything up. Then why are you here, Lowe? He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Maren's body went very still. A stillness that was not calm, exactly, but the particular suspension of a person who has trained themselves not to react to movement in their peripheral field, who has had years of practice at converting the spike of adrenaline into a managed pause rather than a visible flinch. He pulled out a photograph. Set it on the counter between them. She looked at it. It was a field hospital, a real one, not the clean, well-lit facilities shown in recruiting material. A repurposed structure with sandbag reinforcement and the particular quality of improvised lighting that made everyone look slightly yellow. There were 4 people in the frame. One of them was on a stretcher, face turned away from the camera. The other 3 were grouped near a portable surgical station. One of the 3 was her. She was 29 in that photograph. She was wearing a uniform that did not match any standard issue identification. Her hair was loose, which she would never have permitted if she'd had warning. And she was doing something with her hands that required absolute concentration, and she was not looking at the camera. She had not known the camera was there. She did not pick up the photograph. "Where did you get this?" she said. It came out as a statement rather than a question. "Kovacs had it," Sondergaard said, quietly, in his effects. Maren's hands, which had been resting flat on the counter, curled inward. A small movement, barely visible. Her fingertips pressed into the laminate. Andrus Kovacs, specialist, formerly. Age 31 at time of death. He had kept a photograph of her, apparently, that she had not known existed, and it had come back to her from his effects in the hands of people he had trusted. And she had not known he trusted them with things like this, with her. And now he had been dead for 2 years, and she was standing in an ICU in the middle of the night, holding this information, and she had nowhere to put it. "Tillotson," Lowe said. "I'm fine," she said, which was what she always said, which had the specific function of ending that particular line of inquiry. Phoebe had moved slightly closer unconsciously, the way people move toward things that seemed like they might be important. Maren made a small motion with her hand. "Stay," without looking at her. And Phoebe stopped. "He talked about you," Dawit said. His voice was low. It was the first full sentence he'd offered, and it landed differently than Sondergaard's clipped efficiency, or Lowe's careful gentleness. It landed like a fact. Not all the time, not constantly, but when things were, When things were bad, he talked about you, about the night at the outpost. The night at the outpost, she had not called it anything in her own head. She had not named it because naming it gave it a fixed address, and she had spent considerable energy ensuring that it did not have one. The outpost in the Kunar province. November, the particular quality of cold that pressed through every layer of clothing and settled into the joints. Lowe had been there. Sondergaard had been there. Kovacs had been there, wounded, pressure dressing soaked through on his thigh, telling her in a low, steady voice that he was fine. It didn't hurt. She should go deal with the others first. She had dealt with the others first because he was right, because triage was not personal, because the calculus of a trauma bay or a blown-out outpost under fire was not about relationships, but about resources and survivability, and the cold math of keeping as many people alive as the situation allowed. She had dealt with the others first, and then she had come back to Kovacs, and she had repacked the dressing with her hands already shaking from the cold and the adrenaline drop, and he had said to her, "You're good at staying calm," and she had said, "I'm not calm," and he had smiled and said, "I know, that's the point." He had survived that night. He had not survived 2 years later. He said, "You were the reason we got out," Dawit said. "All of us, that night." He said you made the calls you had to make and didn't hesitate and didn't flinch, and that was the reason we were still here. Kovacs made his own calls, Maren said. Her voice was controlled. She had practice. Everyone in that outpost made their own calls. Tillotson. Lowe reached forward and pressed his fingers very gently against the photograph. He didn't push it toward her. He just touched it, the way you touched something you'd been carrying for a long time. "We found out you were here 3 months ago. We spent 3 months trying to figure out if we should come." What decided it? It was Sondergaard who answered. She crossed her arms, which on her was not a defensive gesture but a holding steady one. Dawit's surgery was in February. Shoulder reconstruction. Post-op it was rough. He had a night nurse who sat with him through most of it because he wasn't doing great, and she stayed past her shift, and he kept saying afterward that he didn't know how to thank her, that it wasn't the kind of thing you could thank someone for. She paused. "It made us think about you." Maren looked at Dawit. He met her eyes, and there was something in his face that she recognized. The particular expression of someone who had been in very bad pain and had come out the other side of it not entirely the same shape as before. She was familiar with that shape. She saw it in the mirror, sometimes at angles. Kovacs knew what he was doing, Maren said carefully. He knew the risks. Everyone in that situation knows the risks. "I was doing my job. That's not what this is about," Lowe said. "Then what is it about?" Lowe was quiet for a moment. The ICU breathed around them. The ventilator on bed 3, the soft percussion of monitors, the distant rumble of the floor polisher making its way down a hallway somewhere below them. "We all did things we're still carrying," Lowe said. "All of us. You know that. And for a long time we carried them. I don't know. Alone. In our own separate boxes." He looked down at the photograph for a moment, then back at her. "But he kept this picture. He kept it for 4 years, Tillotson. He kept it because that night, you were there, and it mattered that you were there, and he wanted to remember that it was possible for someone to show up in the worst situation and do the right thing. Every single time, without ever once making it about themselves." Maren's throat was doing something she didn't entirely approve of. The night shift was supposed to be simple. Bad coffee and charts, and the specific, predictable irregularity of the very sick recovering or failing to recover. She was supposed to clock out at 7 and drive home and sit in her apartment and listen to the particular silence of a place that belonged only to her and make herself a reasonable meal and go to sleep. She had a routine. The routine was load-bearing. "I didn't save everyone," she said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. If you're here because you think, I didn't save everyone, Lo." Kovacs came back from that night and then he didn't come back from something else. And I wasn't there, and there's nothing neat about that. She stopped, steadied herself. There's no version of this story where the math works out even. "No," Lo said. "There isn't." Silence. "That's not why we came," Sondergaard said, more gently than Maren would have predicted. "We didn't come because the math works out. We came because he would have wanted you to know that someone still has this." She touched the edge of the photograph. "That you're still in someone's hands. That you don't just disappear." Phoebe had pressed herself against the medication cart and appeared to have forgotten how to blink. In bed, too, a patient shifted, and the monitor adjusted with a small soft chime, and the sound seemed to remind the room that it was a hospital and not a sealed chamber removed from ordinary time. Maren looked at the photograph. She had been 29. She had not known the camera was there. She had been doing her job, and she had not been performing it for anyone, and someone had kept a record of that. And now the record had found her in an ICU in central Pennsylvania at 4 in the morning with cold coffee going stale on the counter, and a new nurse watching from 6 feet away with an expression of absolute bewilderment. She reached out and picked up the photograph. The paper was soft at the edges from handling. She turned it over. On the back, in Kovacs's blocky handwriting, in pen that had bled slightly into the paper fibers, Kunar. Nov, the good part. Her chest did something that she did not have adequate clinical terminology for, the good part. She had not thought of that night as having a good part. She had filed it under extraction successful, casualties acceptable, objective met, which was the format that allowed for storage without active corrosion of the container. She had not thought to look inside the container for anything that might have qualified as good. He had. He had looked inside the container, and he had found something, and he had written it down. "You should be on a restricted floor," she said after a moment. Her voice was back, almost steady. "Yes," Lo agreed. He didn't move. "If you come back tomorrow, I can arrange visitor clearance for afternoon hours." Sondergaard looked at her. Something in her expression shifted, barely perceptible, but there. "We were planning to drive back tonight." "Change your plans," Maren said. It was not a request exactly, and not a command exactly. It landed somewhere between the two. "There's a decent diner 2 blocks east that opens at 6. I'm off at 7. Lo was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Good." She set the photograph down on the counter, not back to them, facing up. "Now get off this floor before the attending comes through, and I have to explain why I let 3 people in tactical gear wander into the ICU at 4 in the morning." Sondergaard almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a movement, but Maren catalogued it. They left the way they'd come. Deliberately, quietly, the measured tread of their boots retreating down the corridor, the elevator chiming once, and then the sound of them was gone, and the ICU was breathing again in its usual rhythm, the ventilator and the monitors and the distant polisher, all of it ordinary. Phoebe had not moved from beside the medication cart. "Tillotson," she said. Her voice came out smaller than usual. "Bed 7 needs his morning labs drawn at 5:30, Maren said, turning back to the computer. Go ahead and pull the order set so we don't fall behind. Were they? Phoebe? Yeah, the labs. 5:30. A pause. Then the soft squeak of sneakers on linoleum, and Phoebe went. Maren sat down in the rolling chair in front of the charting station. She pulled the keyboard toward her. The photograph was on the counter to her right, face up, the blocky handwriting showing clearly under the overhead light. She left it there. She finished the overnight documentation. She signed off on the O2 adjustment for bed 7. She called the pharmacy about a potassium infusion for bed 4. She wrote a note in the handoff summary about the anomalous visitors and the patient in bed 2 who had been restless since midnight. She did all of it in order, methodically, the familiar low-grade work that had been her anchor for the past 11 months. The thing she did because it was necessary, and because being necessary was, in the absence of other organizing principles, sufficient. At 6:45, the day shift started to filter in. The doors hissed open and closed. Voices came in with the smell of cold air and coffee that was better than what the break room produced, carried in insulated cups from outside. The ward began to change its register, louder, brighter, more hurried. Maren gave her handoff report to the day nurse, a methodical man named Osterfeld, who listened without interrupting and asked 2 specific questions which she respected. She retrieved her coat from the break room locker. She clocked out at 7:03. The November morning outside was the kind of cold that was not brutal but was serious. Gray sky, no wind, the specific flatness of pre-dawn light that made everything look two-dimensional. Her car was in the second row of the staff lot, a 10-year-old truck that had rust at the wheel wells and a heater that needed 30 seconds to commit. She sat in it for a moment without starting it. The photograph was in her coat pocket. She had picked it up from the counter at the end of her shift without making a decision to do so, or perhaps she had made the decision without noticing. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the soft, worn edges of the paper, the good part. She thought about DeWitt's shoulder. 3 months of post-op, he'd said, a night nurse who had stayed past her shift. He hadn't known how to thank her. She thought about Kovacs keeping this photograph in his effects for 4 years, carrying it through whatever came after Kunar, keeping it even when. She did not let herself finish the thought, not quite, but she let herself sit with the shape of it, the weight of a person who had decided that what happened at the outpost was worth remembering as something other than a loss. She had not made that decision. She had packed everything from that period into the labeled containers that made it possible to function, and she had driven 3 states away from where she'd last been stationed. And she had taken the night shift at a community hospital in central Pennsylvania, and she had become the person who signed birthday cards but did not attend the parties. And it had worked, more or less. It had been sufficient. She was not in distress. She slept adequately. She performed her job well. She had not thought to look inside any of the containers to see if there was anything in there that qualified as good. Maren pulled the photograph out of her pocket and propped it against the odometer on the dash. In the flat morning light coming through the windshield, she could see herself clearly. The concentration in her posture, the absolute absence of self-consciousness. She had not known the camera was there. She looked like someone who knew what she was doing. She supposed she had. She started the truck. The heater came on after its 30 seconds and began to push warmth against her hands on the steering wheel. 2 blocks east, Lowe and Sondergaard and Dawitt were presumably either already at the diner, or were finding parking, or were reconsidering, or were doing whatever people did when they had driven a significant distance, to hand a photograph to someone who had not asked for it. She pulled out of the lot. The diner had a sign in the window that said it opened at 6, and a smell coming through the door, when she pushed it open, of eggs and hot grease and proper coffee. Dark, not scorched. The kind that tasted like a decision rather than an accident. Lowe was already there. He had taken a booth in the back, facing the door, because of course he had. Sondergaard was beside him, both hands around a mug. Dowett was across from them, reading the laminated menu with what appeared to be genuine concentration. She stood at the threshold for a moment. The diner was warm. The booths were cracked vinyl, patched with electrical tape in 2 places. The overhead lights were yellow and low and did not hum. The coffee was good. Lowe looked up. He didn't say anything. He just shifted slightly in the booth, making room without making a production of it, and looked at her with an expression that was, she recognized. Simply waiting, not demanding, not requiring anything from her, just present. She walked over and sat down. The waitress came, and Maren ordered coffee and something with eggs, because her body was reaching the end of a 12-hour shift and required fuel. And the 4 of them were quiet for a moment in the way that people were quiet when they had been through something together and didn't need to perform the reunion for anyone watching. "You look different," Lowe said, eventually, "than I expected. You thought I'd look the same as I did at 29? I thought you'd look more," he considered. "Fortified. I'm plenty fortified." "I know," he said. "You look like someone who stopped having to be." She drank her coffee. It was, in fact, good coffee. It tasted like something that had been made with attention rather than desperation. She had forgotten that was a thing coffee could taste like. Outside, the November sky was beginning to lighten very slightly at the edges. Not sunrise, too early, too gray, but the suggestion of it, the promise that it was coming, regardless. She didn't know yet what she'd do with the photograph. Put it somewhere she could see it maybe, or not. She didn't know if she'd stay in touch with these 3 people, or if this was the kind of thing that existed only in its own moment, and didn't need to be converted into anything ongoing. She didn't know. She was sitting in a warm diner with people who had known her before she became the person who kept everything in labeled containers. And the coffee was good, and the eggs came out right, and outside the sky was getting lighter in its slow November way, and she let it be enough. It was enough.